Okay, welcome back. So, book 11, we've got our penultimate book before the epic concludes in book 12. What do we expect from penultimate books? Let's have a think. So, obviously, in the Iliad penultimate book, book 23, we had the funeral games. We had this sort of development of Achilles' character, and we got this almost roll call of all of the Greek heroes where they sort of got to flex their muscles, sort of step on stage, get their round of applause before we had this sort of climax in the final book. We already know in the Aeneid what is going to happen in this final book. We know from Jupiter that Aeneas and Turnus are going to clash. We know from the Scroll of the Fates that Turnus will be defeated and Aeneas will continue the Roman line by marrying Lavinia. So we can expect that from book 12. And it has been teased from us really since book 7, where we had Turnus's army and Turnus vowing to clash with Aeneas in war. So book 11 delays, builds the tension, gives a big sort of fighting moment before the ultimate clash as well. But we also see the fallout from the war so far, and we see Evander mourning Pallas. And so really it's an all-encompassing book where we're starting to tie all of the strings together from the narrative. As always, please make sure you've read book 11, made notes, make sure that you will make notes as you listen to this video, otherwise it's an entirely waste of our time. So thinking about book 11, the key events, what I would say are the key events or things to remember about book 11. Obviously, Pallas's body is returned to Evander. I'm going to go into that in more detail later when we go through the key themes. But that has been being built up to since book 8, really, where Evander said, look, if you're going to die, kill me now. And then we knew that Pallas was sort of likely to die, and he finally died in book 10. Diomedes, he refuses to join the war against the Trojans. He says, no, thank you. You're stupid if you try and fight them. I fought them once before. I'm lucky I survived. I'm not going to fight them again. Diomedes also, just a quick reminder, obviously, when we very first saw Aeneas, he was in book 1, he was in the shipwreck. He was wishing that he had died on the battlefield. And the particular person that he picks out and says, I wish you had killed me, is Diomedes. So we've had Diomedes built up since book 1 as this fantastic hero, this great sort of nemesis of Aeneas. And even in book 11, even though they've, Aeneas presumably has sort of had this big rivalry with Diomedes, and we know that they have indeed from the Iliad, not in books that we've read, but they clashed in the Iliad. So here Diomedes says, look, I'm backing away. Aeneas is too great. I'm not going to stand and try and sort of fight this tide of fate. We get the Latin Council where they deliberate what to do, and we get this Drances character involved, who we will again go into in a little bit more detail in a second, where they're debating whether to continue war or not. Lots of them wished not to continue war, and Drances suggests that Turnus and Aeneas just have a 1v1, but they get distracted by the noise of Aeneas and his men sort of beginning to approach the city, and so the war restarts. At the very end of the book, we get Camilla, our warrior maiden. She dies. So there are sort of key events in what I would say is book 11. So in book 11, we see this sort of focus on Aeneas and Turnus. Obviously, these are key themes. These two great characters. We have to, the specification says that we should be looking at them in terms of Greek and Roman heroes. Remember what I said in one of the previous videos where I said if you get a heroism question, the key thing that you need to do in your introduction is sort of evaluate whether you are evaluating these characters as Roman heroes or Greek heroes. And you could be asked about the characterization of major and minor characters. So look at revise all your major characters, but remember it could also pick up on smaller characters as well. So in terms of how book 11 plays into these characters, let's start with Aeneas. So he's actually fairly absent in this book. We see him at the start and we see him at the very end, but we don't see him really engaging in much fighting. We see him engaging in a lot of conversation and a lot of sort of diplomacy, very much as a leader. So We see that he has this respectful treatment of the dead. It's a very heroic trait. It's very wonderful the way that he treats Pallas. He's sort of very emotional about Pallas. He mourns him, but then he turns, once he sort of sends Pallas's body off to the funeral, he's then very focused and returns his men's sort of thoughts back to war, again showing himself to be a fantastic leader. We also see that he is he is respectful not only of Pallas when he dies, but also when he's killed Mezentius, he gets his Garath and he rightfully dedicates it to the gods. Remember, that is a key Roman trait, dedicating a Garath to the gods as a thank offering. He's then also really respectful of Drances when Drances comes and asks for a sort of temporary truce in order to bury the dead. Aeneas really, really supports that. He loves the idea of burying the dead. And we see it with Pallas and his funeral procession, that we see a very military and very ritualistic way of honouring the dead. And we see Aeneas, he covers his head in the same way that a Pontifex Maximus covers his head, as a Roman priest would cover their head. And so we see Aeneas sort of establishing these Roman rituals of burial. Obviously, this is really important for Aeneas because he has been to the underworld in Book 6. So he understands, he really, really feels that rightful treatment of the dead is super duper key. But he's willing to offer that not only to his people, but to his enemies as well. We see that as a warrior, the fact that he's feared by Diomedes is really, really important. He's got this reputation. If we think of being a hero, their time, their reputation, it hinges on the opinions of others. And so the fact that one of his previous enemies thinks so highly of him, as does Drances, his current enemy. Drances says, shall we worship your justness or your feats in war first, which you're just too good. I can't even begin to imagine what I would praise about you first. So Aeneas' reputation among his enemies is fantastic, as well as among his allies, as we see with Evander as well. And we get Aeneas in this book, he's relatively silent, certainly when compared to Turnus. And I'm going to come back with a scholar in a second to think about why that is important. If we think of Turnus, on the other hand, it's a less flattering book for Turnus. So he's extremely disrespectful of Drances. Fair enough, Drances hates him, okay? And we see that Drances is jealous of his youthfulness, he's jealous of his beauty, but he is super duper disrespectful of Drances. And the fact that Drances and some of the men are sort of starting to lose their buy-in with Turnus shows that his reputation is faltering. He's also arrogant and he's disrespectful of Aeneas and the Trojans. When he speaks in the council, he mocks them, he derides them, he talks about how they are constantly defeated, how they're women, etc. He's completely disrespectful, whereas Aeneas says, look, if you want peace, I would have given this to you gladly, but unfortunately now we can't. For Aeneas, it's almost as if he would have been happy to have peace in the first place, but now that the war has happened, and now that so many of his men have been killed, he has no choice but to follow through with that. And that becomes even more legitimized and solidified by the fact that Pallas has died and Evander asks for his vengeance, which we'll come back to in a second. So back to Turnus. In this big speech, he says, look, if what you guys want is for me to fight Aeneas 1v1, that's fine, I'll do it. But he doesn't follow through with that. And for me, that's very reminiscent of Paris in Book 3 of the Iliad, where he says, yeah, I'll fight him, and then actually doesn't. And in that speech where he speaks to the council, we see very clearly his motivations. He doesn't mention Lavinia until the very last line of his speech. He is motivated by pride, he's motivated by bravado, by his reputation. And these are all things that are going to be his downfall. And then finally, when he does get into war, he allows Camilla to defend the city instead. He says, look, I'll go and do an ambush over here. You defend the city. Allowing anyone else, but particularly a woman, to defend the city, I think puts a big question mark over Turnus's heroism and characterization. And now if we look at this quote by Macchia, which I'll leave you with, and I would suggest you just pause it and write it down, but don't quote this in your essay because it's too big. But point out the fact that Mackie mentions Aeneas's silence as the poem goes on. So we get that he has only 46 lines in book 11. In book 12, he only has 47 lines. So he has fewer than 100 lines of speech in the final 2 books of the poem. Thinking about why this is important contextually, remember Romans hated sophists, hated people that could speak and use their words. If you think of somebody like Donald Trump, or these sort of terrible like Piers Morgan-y type characters that can use their words in a manipulative way to try and sway public opinion, they had just emerged out of very volatile political background, particularly if you're thinking about people like Cicero, who then sort of led people to murder people like Catiline without a trial. The idea of speaking is not great. It shows that you are full of hot air, full of bluff. And so Aeneas versus Turnus, if we look at the 2 of them in book 11, that's really, really a stark contrast in terms of how much they speak. Now, the second key theme that I want to focus on is war. So this could come up in several ways based on the syllabus. So obviously you could get a question on the portrayal of war. That has come up before. You could get a question on family and friendship. I think that book 11 is particularly focusing on Evander is key there. But also obviously the part played by women in the epic. Now, women did come up last year. I think it's unlikely to come up again, if I'm completely honest. It came up for both the Iliad and the Aeneid. So in terms of family, friendship, pact, loyalty, all of those sorts of things, the pietas versus furor, that's where I think book 11 is really going to come out. There are 3 ways in which I think that war is really demonstrated, or the impact and the nature of war is really demonstrated in book 11. The first one is through Pallas, a really key character, obviously. If you get a question on war and you haven't mentioned him, you're a silly sausage. He gets this huge funeral procession, so he, to some extent, is glorified. So obviously he's a young man who has lost his life in war, and he was barely in there. He was in there for maybe 25 minutes, right? And it's his first war, and he gets killed. But he gets this huge, very honourable military procession back home. He's glorified not just by Aeneas, but by Evander, for his killing spree. Evander says that the only comfort I can now take is the fact that you laid so many Rutulian dead with your sword. He is sent back, and in fact, if you think of how he is sent back with all of his things and his belongings, his chariot wheels are described as dripping with Rutulian blood. They're still drenched in blood. And so he really, really got that idea of sort of creating your teammate and creating your chaos through your actions and through your killing spree. So to some extent, the young men are glorified in war for their killing spree. And this should remind us as well as people like Nissus and Euryalus, who were glorified by Virgil through his apostrophe, but at the same time were sort of dismissed and criticised for their rashness. And so that was what ended up killing them. On the other hand, so one hand, Pallas is really glorified for his behaviour in war. On the other hand, I would really encourage you to go back and have a look over this simile of him being described as a flower. I think he's a poppy or a flower that has been plucked before its time by a virgin maiden, by the thumb of the virgin maiden. This idea that he is beautiful, he's really sort of salt of the earth type person, and yet he was gone before his time. Pallas's death is hugely important in the narrative as it justifies Aeneas's righteous motivation for his furor. Remember, furor not always a bad thing if it is righteously justified. And Pallas's death and Evander vowing for Aeneas to avenge him gives Aeneas that justification for his furor, which you are going to see in book 12. So it's really important because I think lots of people read book 12 and think Aeneas's behaviour and his character is completely out of line with everything that we've learned so far about Aeneas and everything that we've been told that a Roman should be. But he is righteously motivated here, and a Roman would certainly read it that way, and Aeneas, Augustus would want it to be read that way because he obviously avenged Julius Caesar's killers, and that's the way that Virgil, I think, would want us to think about it as well. The second person that obviously portrays the sort of impact of war that we get focused on is Camilla. Camilla is a fantastic woman in war. She inspires all of the other women. If you notice when she's fighting, all of her people are women. And we got in book 9 when we were first introduced to her, the women were coming out and they were yearning to fight because they saw Camilla. And we see that with in the battle, she is a key leader. She influences the tide of battle. When she's alive, the Volscians and the Latins are doing really, really well. The moment that she dies, the Trojans surge forward. So she was crucial to the war effort for them. She is also beloved of the gods. She's beloved of Diana. Diana avenges her death, obviously, by sending Opus down. Being beloved of the gods is a very heroic trait. I would say Camilla here embodies all of the things that we've been taught that a male hero should also be. She's beloved by the gods. She's excellent in war. She inspires other people. She rallies her people. She's a good influence on them. She's brave. She's compared to an Amazon, and her people are compared to Amazonians, which I'm going to unpack in just a second. But ultimately, she's killed by her lust for jewelry, which is a very female thing. And, one could argue that heroes are killed, such as Euryalus, he's killed for his lust for Geras. Camilla is killed for her lust for a brooch. It's a very particular sort of jewelry rather than a sword or a shield or a helmet. It's something that's very dainty and feminine. And so ultimately it's her femininity that brings her down. And then finally, I've just sort of put vaguely others. And we see the impact of war on other people. So we get obviously Evander, he mourns, he's driven by his desire for revenge. He says, the only reason that I'm now still alive is so that I can hear the news that Turnus is dead. We get that the Latin people are troubled when Turnus wants to fight. We hear that the reaction of the Latin people is that they are troubled. The women and the fathers, they rush to their walls and they watch the Trojans approaching from the walls. So they're very scared. And we also get Pallanteum's women. They descend into mourning when Pallas's body is returned. Obviously, Pallas doesn't have a mum. He doesn't have a mum. He doesn't have a girlfriend. And so the women as a collective in Pallanteum have to take up the mourning for him instead. So they're the sort of key things that I bring to your mind in terms of war. And here are a few, I'm just going to give you 2 quotes from a scholar, Ingo Gildenhard. So we've got, obviously, this focuses on Camilla. So this idea of her masculine and her feminine side, where she destabilizes the sort of the duality between men and women. This is quite a long quote, and I would take bits out of it if you got a quote on women. And there are 2 questions there. Does Virgil give us a clear depiction of women in his narrative? Are they one-dimensional or are they 3-dimensional? And are women more of a help or a hindrance to the Roman race? Like I said, women have come up already, unlikely to come up again, but worth you thinking about in terms of war, so you can bring them in tangentially for an essay on war. And then finally this quote, so all 4 characters, Penthesilea, Dido, Camilla, Cleopatra, are all significant others of each other as doomed female leaders in a male world. Penthesilea was the leader of the Amazons. When did we see her? We saw her in book 1. She was depicted on the temple fighting in the Trojan War. And that is the last thing that we're told that Aeneas was looking at before Dido enters, and he then sees Dido. So we're supposed to make this connection between Penthesilea, the leader of the Amazons, and Dido. Where obviously there are lots of reasons why we would make this connection between Dido and Cleopatra. They're both Eastern women, seducing, dying, etc. And then we get Camilla comes in as well, as compared to an Amazon. So we're making that connection with Penthesilea. She's fighting against the sort of Roman race. So we get that she's Dido and Cleopatra in that as well. All of these women that step outside of the normal bounds of women in the Roman world die. So yes, Virgil gives us strong women. The only woman that survives is Lavinia, and she is boring as hell. And we'll find out more about Lavinia and what happens to the other women, such as Amata, in book 12. Spoiler, they die.